Awesome. Well, thanks for being here today, Ketan. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Laura McKinnon spoke very highly of you, a previous guest on the podcast, and I know you had mentioned you worked together previously. Um,
Yes.
it's always interesting and surprising to me how tight knit this career development community is and how many people know each other. So I'm really glad you're here to share, your story and insights on career development because everyone says things in a slightly different way, and so I'm excited to kind of hear the way you talk about some of the things I've actually seen you comment on already. I checked out your previous podcast on the addictive brain. You have some great articles on university affairs, one of which is a topic we're trying to cover in this podcast, which is tailoring your resume. So excited to hear your thoughts on that. And thank you for checking out the podcast yourself. I know you checked out a couple episodes with Andrew, possibly with Danuka, another mutual friend of ours. So you probably already know the first question I'm going to ask, which is my favorite question of the show. And that's, how did you get to where you are today? I already know you have a bit of a unique story about how you got into career development, but I'd love to hear, in your own words, how did you get into career development, Kathan, and what sort of stops have you made along the way?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me, Imran. It's a great pleasure. I was actually looking at your LinkedIn and saw that you yourself have had a really interesting career journey from being a mechanical engineer to going into sort of relationship building and now working in education technology. So it's really interesting. So I am actually a biologist by training. So I have a PhD in molecular biology,
Oh,
and postdoctoral training in molecular biology. So I made my transition into career development fairly late. Uh, so I'll start from the beginning, and you can feel free to interrupt me if I
oh, this is
keep
my favorite
going.
part. I'm
Uh,
already interested.
so, so I'm originally from Mumbai, India. I did my bachelor's and master's there, in microbiology and then life sciences, which is general biology. And then I worked in cancer research for 2 years at a government research institute. And then shortly after that, I worked briefly at a pharmaceutical biotech sort of company. I had realized this was in the early 2000s that my career had kind of reached a peak and it wasn't kind of going anywhere. So I decided to pursue a PhD in the States with the intent that the PhD would maybe open up more doors. So I applied to PhD programs as an international student, got into a PhD program at UT Health Science Center in San Antonio, Texas. And I ended up doing schizophrenia research. So I was doing sort of the biology of schizophrenia. So I was looking at a protein that is normally protective and helps the brain, just normal physiological conditions, but in schizophrenia, its functioning is impaired. So I was looking at how it affects the immune system because your immune system can also contribute to the development of schizophrenia. So I did that, and then during my PhD, I realized that um, so much of your career is dictated by having the support of your supervisor, and that there was very limited career and professional development support for grad students because I think the assumption was that at that level you have it all figured out, which is not true. So I would always see undergraduate students getting a lot of support or medical students getting support, but not graduate students. And so the school I went to is a medical school slash dental school. So I would always think, wouldn't it be great to have career development that's dedicated for graduate students?
Mm-hmm.
And I think around that time, maybe 3 or 4 years later, is when a lot of universities started having dedicated staff for career and professional development. So during my PhD, I really liked research, I really liked teaching. So I was thinking I will become a professor someday. And in biology, it's common to do something known as a postdoc, which is the analogy that I usually use is similar to doing residency for MDs. A PhD by itself is not enough. You have to do kind of more independent training to establish yourself as someone that can run their own research program. And so I did my first postdoc at UT Austin, where I was part of a leadership group that organized career and professional development events for other postdocs and grad students. And while doing that and while getting exposed to career and professional development events during my PhD, I realized that I really enjoyed participating in these events, organizing these events. And at the back of my mind, I always thought, wouldn't it be great if this was an actual career path? I didn't know if it was one. And then we had a staff member from UT Austin collaborate with us who was in that kind of a role. And that's when I realized, oh, these kinds of roles do exist. And then I did another postdoc, and it was becoming very clear to me that I enjoyed interacting with students
Hmm.
more than, writing grants or doing bench research. But pivoting was a little bit of a challenge because I was an international student and then an international postdoc in the US, and visa issues, unfortunately, have um, quite a large effect on whether you can transition into the kind of career you want or not, especially if it's not directly related to your major.
Right.
So, as a PhD, the logical thing people expect is that you go into either an R&D role or you become a professor. And so if you wanted to do anything that was outside of that realm, it was challenging to do it without a green card or without, permanent residency.
See.
So I was thinking about what I should do next, and that's when I decided to make the move to Canada. So in December 2020, I moved here. But a year before doing that is when I started kind of networking with people. So I had already kind of done a lot of exploration, and maybe you can talk about that separately, but to narrow down what career paths I would like to pursue. And then I started doing informational interviews with people on LinkedIn in Canada because I really didn't know anyone here. And that's when I spoke to probably 30 to 40 people in different career paths. These were all PhDs that had gone into R&D in industry, career development, scientific writing. And I went down that list and I would ask them questions that would really inform me about what their day-to-day was like so that I could kind of eliminate possibilities and narrow it down to one or two roles that I could then really pursue and kind of decide what I needed to do to be competitive for them. So I went about it in a tried to be very logical about it and also being aware of what the job market was here, coming in as someone that's not from Canada. So through that process, I started volunteering with an organization, a couple of organizations in Canada. And that's how I met Dinuka, actually. We collaborated to do some events for career practitioners. I did an informational interview as part of that event with someone that attended the workshop. That person told me to apply for my very first job, which was at TMU. And that's how I got my break into career development. So my first role was helping graduate students and postdocs in the Faculty of Science at TMU with career development. And that was mainly sort of one-on-one advising and workshops. So that was how I got my start, which was around that. I got my first role in January 2021, so a little over 3 years ago.
Oh, well, this is why I like asking the question, Keithan, is because it's always interesting to hear, what people were doing before, becoming part of this field. And for someone like you who is so deep into, one completely different field, I can imagine it was difficult to make that transition, just even internally, as you thought about, you know, going from something you had put a lot of time into this new interest that it developed. Um, I think that's challenging for a lot of people. And I hear that many times that people started out with a plan to do one thing. They put a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of passion into it, but their interests change. Um, is that something you see happen often? And do you have any advice on how to handle, the conflicting emotions that might come with that?
Oof, that's a tough question. So yes, I see that happen quite a bit. There's a theory in career development called chaos theory, which means you embrace the chaos and try to find what works for you within that. So, when we eat at a buffet, we try a couple of different things and then we go for
Uh,
seconds for the things that we really like, right? We get a second
yes,
serving of the things we really like. So I think it's a natural process to falter or not necessarily fail, but try a couple of things to figure out what you like, what you dislike, and then hone in on what you like. So what I tell people is go in with an open mind. Um, I think especially for people that have been in environments where they may have been critiqued quite a bit, or maybe they've been uh, in these environments where they have to be high performing all the time.
hmm
There's a risk of getting imposter syndrome, and so I tell people if you're dealing with imposter syndrome, start writing down kind of the things that you really enjoy doing because that can really help you hone in on what you would like to do. So make a list of things you enjoy doing and then make a list of things that you don't enjoy doing because as important as it is to have an awareness of what you like, I think it's even more important to know what you don't like
I agree.
so that you can eliminate those possibilities and not have that interfere. So I think my advice for people would be there is some natural sort of I think there's a scientist, a PhD, her name is Ashley Ruba. She talks about discipline or career mourning because you've spent so long on your PhD, there will be a period of time where you feel like, am I betraying my discipline by
Yeah,
going into something that I don't necessarily have not gone to school for, but enjoy doing? And that is a very natural and normal phenomenon. But the idea is then creating an awareness of what you like and really pursuing that. So keep an open mind is I think the gist of it.
that I really appreciate that. That's such a thoughtful answer, Ketan. It's honestly a tricky question to articulate. So I really appreciate that you understood what I was trying to ask you there, and I think you got to the heart of it. Um, I really like the idea of the chaos theory. I think it can feel chaotic for people, and I was just at an event, a conference with people who are in education, people who are career development professionals and they're mid-career professionals. I think, like you said, there's often a lot of support for new grads and undergrads, and it kind of feels like, that group of people are trying to figure out what they want to do. But after that, everyone kind of knows. And it's not really the case, right? There's this entire group of people who are partway through their careers who are back to asking themselves that question. And I think it's helpful to say, hey, embrace that chaos. It's going to feel a little bit unfamiliar and strange. I think acknowledging that there's a mourning period after deciding to move away from something you've put a lot of time into is again helpful to recognize and not feel like it should just be obvious. Um, and there's one other thing I'd like to ask about that period of time before I ask you some of the other questions, especially some of the things that I've seen you write about. But it feels like for some, they almost need to step away from what they're doing to find that next thing. I think for you, it sounds interesting that you were able to kind of do something while still being part of research and your PhD, and you sort of discovered that. But I was quite surprised at this recent conference to hear people say, I'm not sure what I want to do. I don't know what that next thing is. And so the buffet approach again is helpful to think about to try little things. Um, but the question I was going to ask is, do you see it often take people a year, like it did for you, to do some of that planning to transition, or what's the time period normally like for people to make that change in your experience?
I think what a lot of career professionals, career development professionals may not want to mention is there is a little bit of luck. There is a little bit of serendipity when it comes to,
Hmm.
landing a position or figuring out what you want to do.
Yeah.
And that process can take longer for some people. It can take a couple of months for some people. So there's no um, defined time frame really. But the other important thing is for you to not also, and this is very hard to do because we are human beings, so it's very easy to compare to another
Yeah.
person. But you have to realize that everyone's career paths are going to be very different. It's like a bunch of squiggly lines, running in parallel. For some, the degree of how squiggly those lines are is going to be more than for others. And so there is no, yes, it can take time. And sometimes it's also circumstances. I mean, I've seen people making it to the final rounds of interviews for jobs they were really good fits for. But there's something that propelled someone else to getting the position. That could be because the company already had someone in mind, like an internal candidate. Now that's something you can't control, right? So my advice to students and postdocs is worry or think about what you can control because there's no sense in worrying about what you cannot control, which is factors like who they may have in mind already. So, and that is things like, networking is something you can definitely control. Upskilling is something you can definitely control. Keeping yourself well versed about what's happening in the field or fields you're interested in, that's something you can control. So there are things you can control, but that serendipity that I was talking about before, that's something you cannot. So you can just worry about honing in your skills and focusing on really creating sort of a presence for yourself, and then hope that that will translate into a transition, a career transition.
That's super helpful to hear because I think sometimes people expect it to happen within a certain time frame, and I think it's just again helpful to acknowledge that time frame can be different for everyone. I think it's extremely um, impressive that you put about a year's worth of effort into making that transition and into networking and booking those informational interviews. I hope people watching this recognize, okay, it's a process and it can take a year, it can take longer for some people. But I think that's also where the luck comes from is, attending the events where you met people like Danuka and people who recommended those first few jobs for you. It's lucky for sure, but it's also, you put yourself out there. You were in that state of mind to try things. So when you mentioned that you did about 30 to 40 informational interviews, how many did you request? Did everyone say yes, or did you get a lot of did a lot of people not respond? Like, how many did it take to get to 30 or 40 conversations?
It's been a while, so I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think I started slow where I would send out maybe one or two requests a week.
Okay.
And when it became closer to the time that I was moving to Canada, so maybe 2 or 3 months before, I would send 5 to 10 requests a week. This was back when LinkedIn didn't cap the number
Yes.
of personalized requests you could send.
Okay.
Unfortunately, now I think you need to have the premium feature to be able to do that. But um, it was, I don't remember exact numbers, but it was definitely a small percentage. I would say
Uh,
maybe, I want to say 10% maybe. And that
wow.
might actually be on the higher end.
Okay.
So, one hack that I discovered later, which I wish I had known then, is to look for people's activity tabs on their
Yes.
LinkedIn because that really tells you, I mean, it's not a direct indication, but it's an indirect indication of how active they are, at least in terms of posting content. And you can use that as a proxy for how active they are on LinkedIn. So you can definitely look at that and say, okay, if I've made a list of 50 people that I would like to do informational interviews with, now can I go back to that list and narrow it down by how active they are on LinkedIn so that I can maximize my chances of getting a response. And then obviously personalizing your LinkedIn request and ensuring that you've read the person's profile and you've really tried to find some sort of common factor or something genuine that that person will look at your request and feel compelled to respond to. I think that's also equally important because it's very easy when you're stressed about finding a job to just sort of panic send many invitations,
Yes.
but you want to avoid that because your first impression is very important, right? So you want to make a strong first impression. That's key.
And to me, it doesn't sound like, the first impression you made to the people. First of all, just to take a step back, when you say you did 30 or 40 informational interviews, that sounds like a ton of work to organize that many meetings. But it's almost tip of the iceberg when you think that you actually probably sent out closer to 300 invitations to even get those meetings. So for, again, those watching, when you hear, wow, Keithan has done this many informational interviews, there's actually a ton more work to even get to that point. So if you've sent out one, email and you didn't hear back, don't feel bad. It takes a lot to find the right people. And this is just an incredible example of that. But the next part is what the message actually ends up being. And I hear questions about that all the time. Keithan, is, what should you say when you do send out a message? And based on what I'm hearing from you, I doubt you were asking people for a job. I doubt that your message was, hey, do you have any positions available? So, what were you saying? Like what, or, I know it was a long time ago, but what was the tone of your message when you were reaching out to these folks?
The tone was always put the focus on the other person. So I would never sort of hog the spotlight, if you will, but I would say something like, I'm a biologist or I'm a scientist that's interested in transitioning in career development. I noticed you've made this transition. I would love to learn how you made the transition. So even when I'm explaining this to students, I always say make the other person the focus. Because when it comes to networking, it's about forming genuine relationships that are synergistic.
Hmm.
So the idea is you always go with the spirit of giving first rather than receiving. And so sometimes I would attach a resource that would be helpful for them or something like that once they accepted my request. And so the it was always looking at their profile, finding a common connection or something compelling on their profile that I found interesting. So I want to mention here as well that I actually had a plan A and a plan B. So I picked two career paths
Okay.
and then uh, sort of tried to build networks in both.
Similar or very
Kind of different. One was career development and professional development support for students. The other one was something known as medical writing, which is scientific kind of, not necessarily scientific, but writing for pharmaceutical companies. So you see the ads you'll see for drugs and stuff like that. That's
yeah.
one example of medical writing.
Okay.
So the way I tried to connect both was writing about career development and writing about scientific writing or medical writing.
I see.
So on LinkedIn, I had to be very careful about how I wrote my LinkedIn profile so that it would look like I was open to both. I don't recommend doing it, but I was being realistic because I didn't know if I was going to be able to find a job in career development. And I wanted to make sure that I had a fallback plan. Um, whether that is something everyone should do, that's everyone's opinion might be different. But I do think it's important that you have a plan A and a plan B because sometimes, like you were asking me before, you may be trying to pursue something and then something else happens completely.
Yeah.
But I think going in with the intent that, yes, I have a fallback plan and I want to develop a network in that as well so that I'm not struggling if plan A doesn't work, is another approach I think people should consider.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to do it, but something to consider.
Well, even if you just haven't quite made up your mind, right? And you're at the information
Sure.
interview stage where I think that's probably common that
Yeah.
people, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's that. And I kind of think of your buffet approach again. It's pretty rare someone's going to the buffet for one thing only, right? It's nice to try
Yeah.
a couple things. So
Yes.
that's that's very helpful to hear. And I just have to say as well, Kathan, that it's again impressive how humble your approach was to this career transition. You know, when I'm thinking about your experience and background as someone with a PhD who's done extremely, intense and detailed research, I would expect that you'd have no trouble finding your next role in whatever field you choose. Um, but I think it's just worth recognizing that you were willing to kind of step back into starting from the beginning and rebuilding your network and not having the expectation that it will just happen, that it's, this work and this framework that you put together to get to where you are today. So I think it's just it's impressive. I'm glad you're here to share your story because I think it will serve as a reminder to people that you need to have that, like you said, an open mind to somewhat starting from the beginning, and that it's okay, and that it's nothing to to fear. It's part of the process that, you came from this area where you were an expert, but this is a new area that you're going to need to learn from. And it's why I encourage people to reach out to career development professionals and speak to someone like yourself who can guide them through the process. And maybe that's the last question I have time for you today. These interviews always go faster than I expect. People have so many
Problem.
interesting things to share, but since you have a focus on, graduate studies and experience with graduate students, do you have where are graduate students who are trying to make this career transition? And let me think of how I want to ask this because I don't think it's a subject we get to touch on often. But where would you say you see graduate students maybe struggling the most, whether or not it's a career transition or just moving into the next phase of their career? Um, what's a common struggle for students at this level?
Um, I think there are one or two that I've noticed. One is definitely um, translating their technical skills into language that employers will understand. One of the things that I learned through the informational interviews is learning the lingo of the field that you want to go into, and then using that lingo on your LinkedIn, in your communication, in your writing, because like I said, you're trying to really create a presence, right? So that people take notice. That's one. So one of the common things I see is people being very technical in their resumes, and then I have to tell them, look, there is a chance that an HR person who's not maybe from the same background as you will be reading your resume. So if you're
So true.
only focusing on their technical and not really talking about the broader, bigger picture of purpose of what you're doing, then it doesn't really help them understand the significance of what you're doing. So I think that's really, really key and that's really important. Um, so I would say that's probably the number one thing that I've noticed. And uh, the second thing, which is kind of tied into that, is because we're so focused on our master's degree or PhD degree and only on how we write in that field, when we're applying for jobs that may be more interdisciplinary, we don't try to be more inclusive of the language that is being used that's at the, let's say, intersection of two fields. So learning how to really translate what you're doing and have people at different levels understand that, I think is really important. There's a really good series on YouTube where a scientist explains their research to a kindergartner, third grader, seventh grader, high schooler, undergraduate person, someone from their field. So they show how the scientist is using different language to kind of describe their achievements
Yeah.
or describe, sorry, their research in a way that each of these people with different backgrounds, different knowledge, are able to understand what they're doing. So I think that framing what they're doing for different employers, and then really recognizing transferable skills as well. So whatever you do, whether it's a bachelor's, a master's, whatever degree or whatever training you're doing, there'll be some skills that are specific to that discipline, maybe, and then there are some that are transferable to multiple disciplines. So recognizing that, yes, I can take these transferable skills and then use them to transition into other career paths. I think that is something that a lot of people are not aware of.
No, and I actually know that's one of the articles that that has been written about you, right? Is your ability to kind of identify those transferable skills and use them to enter this new field here. So, what I'm going to do, everyone, is there will be links in this episode to some of the work that Ketan has written, so you can learn a little bit more about these things. Um, but Ketan, if people wanted to reach out to you, is there a way for graduate students to have a conversation with you to do a little bit of career development directly?
Sure. So I would say reach out to your respective university or your
True.
respective college or university's career practitioner first, because they're right there to give you dedicated career support. I'm happy to share free resources, so they can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I probably won't be able to do sort of detailed career guidance, which is why I mentioned that they
Yeah.
should contact their respective school, because a lot of schools nowadays also have their career services open to alumni. So even if you graduated, you might still be able to take advantage of that. But
That's
I post a lot on LinkedIn. I'm always posting jobs. So even if you necessarily don't want to connect, you can follow me on LinkedIn and just take advantage of whatever resources I'm posting. I post articles, jobs, professional development resources that I think would be helpful for people in my network.
that sounds fantastic. I hope people take you up on that and reach out to, like you said, their respective career development advisors because there are so many practical things that you've shared that it's true. If you're job seeking on your own, it could take you a long time to recognize it's things as simple as checking that the person is active on LinkedIn. That's a very tangible thing you can do to completely change your perception of whether people are responding to you or not. It might not have anything to do with you. They might not be using LinkedIn at all. So it's well worth knowing something like that. It's well worth knowing things like your first interview might not be with someone who has technical experience. It's a strange concept, but it's true. There's often times where HR has to first screen candidates before they meet anyone on the team that you might be a part of. So these are things that are not immediately obvious, and it's why I encourage people to reach out to your career development professionals or to follow someone like Ethan on LinkedIn so that you can, start to see some of these things. But Ethan, I know I've taken a lot of your time, so thank you so much for being here. I hope you join us again in the future. I have a ton more questions for you, but are there any final thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap this one up? Advice that you would like to give?
Sure. Thank you again for having me. It was a great pleasure and wonderful to see all your work with your company as well.
Thank you.
Um, I will say maybe one final thought could be, if you don't have access to career development resources, there's a lot of free content you can get on LinkedIn. There are many, many career coaches who post free content about, how do you optimize your LinkedIn? How do you optimize your resume? Um, YouTube is another great resource because you can find recorded workshops from career centers or from other places. So take advantage of, these free resources as well.
Yeah.
And then there are career magazines like CERIC, Inside Higher Ed, University Affairs that also have great articles. So all of this is out there. It's just you have to take the effort of finding these resources.
It's such a good reminder, Keithan, because I don't know why it feels like we have to do this on our own sometimes. If I was going to try to cook a new recipe, I
Mhm.
probably wouldn't just start putting random
Yeah.
ingredients together. I'd look something up, how do you do this? And that exists for career development. It's there are people who know and who can guide you and give you the recipe, so to speak. And then you can try your own things. But thanks for that great piece of advice and the reminders. And again, thank you for your time today. Truly appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Imran.
Awesome. We will talk again soon. Have a good one.
Take care.